I heard this story from my grandfather. My grandfather is a very kind, good person. He always keeps his promises. If I ask him for anything, he will do it right away, of course, if possible. When I was little, my grandfather always told me scary and funny stories, brought delicious sweets, cookies and various toys. There was a lot of joy and laughter. I always liked the way my grandfather laughs. His laugh is so loud, not like an old man, but like a young one. Many years passed, I grew up. I didn't come to the village very often. I just had a lot of hobbies, and I had to study. I had to do homework. I remember talking with my parents that summer about how I missed the village, my grandparents, that I wanted to visit them as soon as possible. I hadn't visited them for a long time. I was already sick of the noisy city. My beloved grandmother knows how to cook well. Even in the village there are animals: goats, turkeys, cows, ducks, horses, chickens, even fish rates. As I recalled those times, clean fresh air, dense green forest, wonderful flowers, I immediately wanted to go to the village. I put important things in my bag. My mother told my grandfather on the phone to come pick me up. I was well acquainted with the local boys. I remember sitting by the fire every evening and scaring each other with scary stories. I even used to tell stories of my grandfather, climbed into old dilapidated sheds, went inside an abandoned house. Someone told us that in a deserted place, the souls of the deceased owners appear. We were seriously frightened when we heard strange sounds, but it turned out to be a big rat. A girl saw her, who suddenly shook, and how she screamed at the whole house, which already laid her ears. We, frightened to death, immediately ran out of this house. It was about 9 years ago. I went to the window. I saw an old white car drove up. I immediately realized that this was my grandfather. I was delighted, smiled, took 2 bags with things, said goodbye to my mother and father, then ran outside to meet my grandfather. I approached, greeted my grandfather, sat in the front seat, fastened my seatbelt, and we went to the village. I began to ask my grandfather how the neighbors were doing, how my grandmother's health was, and much more. Grandfather smiling, slowly answering my questions and constantly saying, "Granddaughters, how glad I am to see you. You have already become so big." We drove about 5 kilometers. I began to ask about my best friend Harry, who lives in the village. We had a strong friendship. Once it happened that we fell in love with one beautiful girl, but we decided not to fight with each other and leave her, because friendship is more expensive, and there are a lot of beauties in the village. Grandfather suddenly turned gloomy, squeezed the steering wheel with all his strength, made a gloomy face, became darker than the clouds. It was immediately clear that something bad had happened. I thought it would be better to be silent and not ask anything, but the grandfather himself wanted to tell. His story was this. Harry was a good, cheerful guy, still quite young. It's a pity that this happened. He recently turned 18. He is 2 years older than me. He did not drink, did not smoke. He got into a bad situation. His parents went to the city to buy food at the market, called Harry and said that they would have to stay with friends for a few days, and he was forced to sit at home, clean up, chop wood. He is just a young man. He did everything as it should be. I remember I get up early in the morning. I see Harry working and shouting almost to the whole village, "Good morning, Grandfather Johnny." He milked the cow, walked the dog, took the curly sheep to the pasture, watched them all the time, and then went to clean the well. They rarely cleaned the well. It was constantly overgrown with grass, algae, and was covered in some kind of slime. The guy found a long stick, put a rag on it, and set about cleaning the well, wiping the walls and bottom with it. When he cleaned the well a little, he took a bucket and began to draw. Seeing the bottom, I noticed that there was something that looked like rags. He was immediately curious as to what was there. I took a spinning rod, lowered the hook to the bottom, picked up this rag and lifted it up. When he saw this, he turned pale. It was a human skeleton. He immediately had to go to the priest, so that the skeleton was buried in the cemetery, but he dragged him to his home. I constantly had to see how Harry cleans the well. Sometimes the old grandmother was angry and shouted, "Harry, do not bend over much, otherwise you will fall off again." I, too, began to worry. I was going to visit him. Grandmother is just a smart girl. She baked delicious pancakes. I changed clothes and went to him. Opened the shed, but it's empty. It immediately became clear to me that something was not right here. I ran to his doorstep, knocked on the door and heard strange sounds, then everything was quiet. I accelerated and hit the doors with all my strength with my foot, slipped and almost broke my head. It turned out it was not locked. The whole house stank of some kind of rotten stuff. I was scared. I was already starting to think, maybe someone killed Harry, went into all the rooms and saw him lying on the wooden floor in one of the rooms. There was a terrible stench. I already thought that the guy had gone to another world. I was trying to pick him up, and he opens his eyes and looks at me. There are terrible bruises under his eyes, his face is pale, emaciated, he can hardly move his legs. Harry was a smart, handsome, athletic guy, but here he was emaciated, he looked tired and supposedly aged 15 years. I try to lift it, but my legs give way and mumble something. My legs, my legs. It immediately became clear that his legs did not work. Apparently paralyzed, I suddenly thought, perhaps I was ill with something. I put him on a chair and began to ask questions. The guy turns his head away, looks somewhere at the floor, but around. But later I saw that Harry was looking at the skeleton lying in the left corner, near the wall. Then he began to point his finger at the skeleton. I wanted to get closer, but the half-dead Harry grabbed my arm with such force that he nearly broke it. He continued to point his finger at that corner for a long time. I ran home for my wife. Maybe he could help with something, at least feed him. Before leaving, I hear Harry talking, as if with a girl. He promised her something. But when my wife and I entered his house, he abruptly fell silent. My grandma had to feed him, and the next day she came in and nearly fainted. He was crawling on the floor like a zombie with an old rag in his mouth. He didn't hand over the rag, almost bit off her hand when she tried to put him on his feet. Grandmother is already old, but she still managed to bring him into the hall after Harry passed out. The guy became thin as a pencil and light as fluff. It was scary to be in the house. She felt something otherworldly, but when she looked at the very place where the skeleton lay, she did not find any bones there. I thought my husband threw them away, but no one touched the skeleton. Poor Harry. Once at night, I decided to go outside for a smoke. I look, and in the window of an exhausted Harry, a beautiful girl walks around the room. She was so beautiful that I thought it seemed to me, but when I rubbed my eyes, the picture did not change. In the morning, the guy was found dead in his house, lying in a pile of bones and some rags that looked like women's clothes. The next day I went to my friend, told her about this terrible incident. She gasped and said that there were rumors about a young girl who previously lived in Harry's house, who jumped into the well, due to the fact that no one wanted to take her into a wife. The girl's body could not be found, as the well had never been so deeply cleaned. Grandfather did not want to tell me this, he was afraid to upset me, but still I had to.
Thank you for your attention. Subscribe to the channel.